are listening to a podcast from The National.
We've been trying to build up a story over the last few months that 2017 is a watershed moment for e-commerce and the digital economy in the UAE and wider region. A lot of this has been triggered by earlier this year when Amazon bought Souk, and we said the Amazon effect was coming and there would be a constant ripple as a result of that, and perhaps that has borne out. But we would really like to know how much has this growth really taken hold? And perhaps the best way is to go to those that are at the heart of the infrastructure of an industry like e-commerce. I'm Mustafa Alrawi, the National's Assistant Editor-in-Chief, and this is the Business Extra podcast from Newsroom in Abu Dhabi. This episode is about how e-commerce and the digital economy really is taking hold in 2017. Earlier, I caught up with Sirish Kumar, Chief Executive and co-founder of Telr, a digital payments company, payments gateway if you like. They've been around since 2014, are present in Singapore, the UAE, Saudi Arabia, and most recently in India. I spoke to Sirish on the phone in Singapore, and he told me how this really is a watershed moment for e-commerce. Do you describe Telr as a digital payments company?
I describe Telr as an enabler to promote digitization, and there's an ecosystem that is being formed, and I think that Telr is an enabler of that digital ecosystem, and more importantly, what it means also is that the front end offering for the merchants, particularly, or for the online entrepreneurs, is to ensure that they are able to accept payments from anywhere in the world in any currency, and whether it is through social media, whether it is through mobile app or through the website.
I want to pick up on some of the things you touched upon, such as social media and the merchants. But just so that the people out there who might not be familiar with Telr, you are a payments gateway for online digital payments, mobile, as well as regular online. I think you could also be described as a fintech company as well.
That's correct. Because if you split the word fin and tech, what it's basically meaning is we're offering the services which enable payments to be done, of course, leveraging technology. So, hence, I would term this as a fintech company as well.
I mean, one of the reasons why I was keen to talk to you, Sirish, is because you sort of sit in the middle, right, of, as you said, this sort of digital ecosystem. And I really wanted to get your insight into how that's growing. So you've got a base in Singapore, you're active in the UAE, you're active in Saudi Arabia, you're most recently active in India. So you've got a really good perception of how the different markets are working in terms of the digital economy, and particularly where e-commerce is concerned. So it's sort of interesting from your point of view is all the chatter that sort of this year seems to be a benchmark year for e-commerce. Does that bear out in what you're seeing?
I would absolutely agree with you, Mustafa, on this. If you really go back to the reason why Telr was born and where it's going, there is a emerging market play that is gaining prominence from a perspective of leapfrogging from one stage to another stage. And as you have always seen, emerging markets tend to not necessarily reinvent the wheel, which you've seen in the other developed and mature economies, but they would rather look at what's relevant, and there are 2-3 steps which are kind of ignored, and then there's a leapfrogging that happens. And what has happened particularly in the last 12 to 15 months, is that there have been 2 models that have been coming, and which we kind of feel very excited about because of the reasons that I'll mention to you in a short time. The countries that you mentioned are very important from a perspective of driving innovation in the digital space. And what you're also seeing here is that the governments have played a very important and positive role in all the economies that you've talked about. We believe that the governments have realized the fact that the cash to cashless initiative tries to achieve multiple objectives with one with the initiative of moving from cash to cashless. So, for instance, the cost of this of cash is humongous. Second is that the revenues and it's been proven time and again that as the cashless composition of the economy goes up, there's a direct correlation with the GDP growth rate. Now, as you also start looking at the changing dynamics, particularly in the countries like Saudi Arabia, UAE, India, and countries in Southeast Asia, there is a convergence of three things that's happening. One is the millennials. Second is the cost of ownership of a smartphone going down tremendously. And third is a very high social media penetration. What this then does is that it then opens up avenues of innovation wherein you are able to see that the entrepreneurs are able to reach out to much larger population. At the same time, they don't need to spend lots and lots of dollars or dirhams or Indian rupees to get the minimum traction that they would require in the first part of their business.
From my point of view, that all makes sense. And it definitely, goes in line with the narrative. But e-commerce is growing, digital economy is growing, but also there is a definite trust gap. And certainly in the UAE and Saudi Arabia, cash on delivery remains, the majority of the way transactions are done here. On average, at least sort of 70% are people using cash on delivery. And I don't think that's because people are unbanked in the UAE, at least anecdotally from what I've heard from a lot of people in e-commerce. It's actually because there's a lack of trust in a lot of the merchants, in a lot of the companies they're dealing with. They'd rather see the item or get the service before they actually hand over their money. So how do you cope with, it just takes time to build that trust? And sort of off the back of that, does Amazon coming in immediately give sort of a steroidal injection of trust into the space?
So there are few things that I will also try to mention. When you look at any portfolio approach, yes, the figures do show that 70 to 80% is still cash. You have also seen in the recent years that countries like Sweden have completely moved towards cashless economy. Countries like UK have now started seeing that cash is lower proportion as compared to the cashless economy. What we will see in the future is, and if I now try to nail it down to specific businesses, when Telr started, we saw that this was one of the most important discussion points that we had with our clients. Over the last 3 years, what we've seen is that these clients have, and these clients may not be just government, these are clients also in the private sector. The proportion of the cash has gone down from 70% or 75% to anywhere between 50 to 55%. We are also seeing in certain verticals that the proportion of cash is gone down now to 30 or 35% in the last 3-4 years, and specifically those customers that we have been servicing. The important thing here, Mustafa, is that the innovation comes with an ecosystem that becomes less and less fragmented. So, for example, the cash on delivery it does exist because there's no alternative. But we are all very clear that the time it takes for a merchant to get back the money in cash on delivery is at least 10 to 15 times in terms of the period as compared to a cashless mode of transaction. Second is that the cost of doing a cash-based transaction is much higher, because what you do is you engage multiple people, first of all, to reconcile the cash. Second is then someone has to go and deliver the cash in the bank. And at the end of it, there's, again, a reconciliation done. So the cost itself, you will see for merchants, is not something which is immaterial. You would see in the year 2013 and 2014, there were merchants in UAE particularly, which had actually started having a surcharge if the consumers preferred cash. So there was anywhere between 10 to 13 dirhams of surcharge if the consumers were preferring cash as a method of payment.
I mean, the vendor has obviously the advantage when it comes to using a digital payment transaction, but the consumer, again, it comes back to that trust gap. So, what are those conversations that you have with your clients when it comes to being able to bridge that trust gap?
So we had basically, if you term it in terms of a survey or in terms of a conversation with merchants, the three most important factors, you'll be very surprised to see that one of the topmost factor for becoming online is that, or making the consumers accept online payments, is not the trust, but it is the method of convenience. And second is the awareness level. And then, of course, you have this perception that online transactions are definitely much riskier than the offline payments. So you will need to segment the demographics of the online population. So you will see that in the online population, for example, if you are anywhere between 25 to 35 and 35 to 45, you are already a person who has been using a device called a mobile phone as compared to a desktop for majority part of your life. The second is that if you really start looking at mobile phone, the mobile phone then makes you more comfortable because you're spending more and more time online, and this results in more social conversations. And it also means that you have more visibility of various services and products that you can see on the mobile phone. So that population that is there, that is actually more keen to not carry loads of cash in their pockets. Second is that they obviously do not have much time to look at the mode of settling in cash. For example, where do I meet you? Or do you have the change? When we meet, well, I don't have enough change to complete this transaction. Or I actually can think about settling in cash a little later because this is something I don't prefer.
I think demographics are with you, right? I think trends are with you, because the younger generation, the millennials, are comfortable with it, and certainly in the future, as people grow and they become sort of the middle demographic, they'll be very comfortable with it. But I'm still sensing from the sort of older generation now that hesitancy, and it may not be because of a weakness in the digital payments ecosystem. I mean, I think that's pretty strong. And I'll give you an example why, because both yourself and the co-founder of Telr, Elias Ghanem, you both came from PayPal. You yourself in Asia and he in the Middle East. And PayPal's got such a good brand. It's almost like a bank these days, or even better than a bank. So, I certainly have no issues with trust when it comes to PayPal. But it's the vendors that sit in the middle between the consumer and sort of if you like, between yourselves, that are causing the trust issues here, right, of defective goods or not delivering items or transactions failing or all kinds of problems. How does your payment method help in terms of improving that aspect? I mean, what do you provide beyond we've got a great solution to getting the money? What about refunds? What about, all the other things around it?
So that's a good point, Mustafa. In fact, if you really look at our role is to work with the other players in the ecosystem, particularly banks, particularly schemes like Visa and MasterCard or American Express, And what we do is that there are, just to keep it very simple, when you as an online entrepreneur now are wanting to start accepting online payments, there is a KYC documentation process that is first looked at by players like Telr. And now this documentation obviously can become very tedious. There are certain countries where there's a verification done by the bank personnel as well, which means that the bank's personnel actually go into the premises of certain types of merchants to check whether they indeed are genuine, whether they have some existence, or to just cross-verify some documentation. In parallel to that, there are other checks done in terms of what are the consumers saying about the business of these merchants, whether it's on social media, whether there are certain international platforms which house a lot of information around the ownership structures of such merchants, whether they have had some history in different multiple jurisdictions, and is that something clean or is that something that is not clean? Once this kind of information is retrieved about the merchant and the documentation is collated, the banks then have their additional checks in terms of getting into more details on the background of the founders and of the people who own the business. So at the time of the approval, while there is sometimes a little bit of frustration amongst the merchants, why is it taking so much time to get the approval? There are certain verticals which are prone to high risks, and that's why there are certain balances put in place to do the necessary checks before certain types of merchants are onboarded online and start accepting online payments.
More from Sirish, Kumar and Business Extra in just a moment, but first allow me to tell you about the National's other podcasts. Beyond the Headlines takes a deeper dive into the biggest news from the week with a distinct Middle Eastern point of view. And Extra Time from our esteemed sports desk is the best place to chat about the English Premier League and more. Subscribe to both shows as well as this one on iTunes, or find us as always at thenational.ae. You're listening to The National's Business Extra podcast from our newsroom in Abu Dhabi. Weekly, we provide insight and additional analysis on the biggest business, economic and finance stories affecting us here, as well as the wider region and the world. Today, we're talking to the CEO of digital payments company Telr, Sirish Kumar. If I jump to a sort of more broader point of view, the market's growing. So we have to say that we're making progress. That all these things, these know your customers, these checks, that as we become more sophisticated in different markets, that more and more people are paying online, mobile, digitally than they were before. I think the Arab world, I think this year it's something like $20 billion in transactions. It seems your forecast to take about $1 billion of that. Is that correct, or is that just in the UAE?
Yeah, this is just in the UAE that we forecast. And to your point about the $20 billion, I think one of the things that I will say that when we started looking at various inputs from the consultants and the various research reports in 2014, the best estimates were $2 billion and $3 billion, right? So the acceleration that has happened is unprecedented. This figure of $20 billion, for example, you see, I'll not be surprised that if after 1 year this number actually for same year of 2020 is put forth as $40 billion. So the important thing here is that if you really look at the growth that is happening, the top 5 markets across the emerging markets that will really leapfrog in terms of e-commerce are UAE, are Saudi Arabia, are Indonesia, and countries like India. So we also believe that we are in the right markets where the growth has just begun. And more importantly, what the governments have done is they have started thinking about specific regulations to safeguard the interests of consumers, to safeguard the interests of the merchants as well. And we think that whether it's the central bank in India, whether it's the central bank in Singapore or the Monetary Authority of Singapore, and the regulators in UAE and Saudi Arabia, we believe they are also way ahead of the curve because they have continuously been connected to the various regulators across the world in the area of e-commerce. And what they have been doing is coming up with regulations that enable the acceleration.
But it's also meant that there's been a huge, sort of growth of fintech companies. And if I look at your space and I look at the number of people who are trying to be sort of digital payment gateways or enablers of the digital ecosystem, Network International, CC Avenue, PayU, Payfort, then of course you've got the big one, PayPal. So, can you all succeed? Is it growing fast enough with all this sort of fuel behind it to ensure that that everybody can win, or is it going to be a sort of quite a tough competitive battle out there?
So it is also important, Mustafa, to understand that each one, the names that you mentioned, and in the future the players that you will have, each one will have a specific role to play and contribute. So, for example, where Telr is going to be a payment aggregator plus strategy, wherein what we do is we partner with various software management companies, or we also partner with other ecosystem partners, which facilitate more than one kind of service to be given to the merchants, right?
Yeah.
So it becomes more towards a service model than just a pure payment gateway model, right? The other thing that you will see is that as of now, there are, if I have to tell you visually, there are three pies that you'll have to look at. One is a smaller pie, which is the online commerce, which is where we have been focusing on because of the emphasis in the last 2-3 years. But then you will also see markets like bill payment segment. You will see B2B segment opening up. Over and above these two segments, what you will see is many other such verticals that will come up, particularly in the sharing economy space, or in the space where you will also see more hotels and more education sector opening up. And this is, again, these are uncharted territories. These are sectors not yet tapped by the payment companies.
And that's interesting because education, you wouldn't assume that there was some growth in education. But what are you seeing? Why do we need digital payments in the education sector?
So just take an example of UAE. UAE is a platform today of multiple nationalities which are coming from different countries today. One of the facets of UAE has been to harness innovation to ensure that the best international practices with the local element are continuously encouraged. Now, if you really look at education, ironically, today you have many international schools in UAE wherein you're embracing expats and the children to be either teachers or students. Now, it is a very natural thing to look at and saying, how should actually be the payment done? Now, can I look at paying you by check, number one? Now, you and your wife or your spouse is also today engaged in some of the work, and they are double income earning families today. The process of just ensuring that we do not forget to make payments on time, second, getting reminders from the school, and third, just having this instrument of a check being the method of payment is not very effective and efficient at the end of the day. And I'll tell you now from the school side or the college side, the process of collecting the check and then crediting in the bank and finally getting the money is a long time. We talk sometimes of 20 days. Sometimes there are schools and colleges coming to us and saying it takes 25 to 30 days to finally get the money in the bank account from the time the check has been received. Now, in these times, we should not have people sitting in the schools and colleges and universities trying to chase the parents to give the money. Second, then if I call you up and say, hey, Mustafa, your fees for your child is yet to be paid, and you say, well, I've already made that payment. So the fallout of that is that there is no updated reconciliation process today, which creates a lot of friction between the parents and the school staff. So in these times, it's important that the nationalities that are used to working in a different style, in a method that does not take away a lot of their time in terms of looking at the administrative point of giving the checks and giving the payment of various fees, it is very, very essential that the schools, colleges, and universities basically go towards digitization. Now, I'll give you a simple example. There has been a debate in various governments that we have been talking in various countries. And very recently, for example, in India, there has been a regulation that has come in, or a mandate or a direction, where the government is saying that all universities have to accept cashless payments in the next few months, or move towards that very quickly. So the important thing here is that the fact that you can accept cashless payments will make you will make you move towards being more efficient. Your instruments of checks will be gone. You will have an automated reconciliation process, and your cash flow cycle becomes much better. Which also means that the scalability then is not an issue. Today, for example, can I tap a student whose father is, let's say, in the United States? How does he actually make the payment? Does he have to do this bank transfer, which takes like 5 or 7 days to come? Or can it just be done through an online payment, right? So I think this is one of the very essential parts of UAE. And please remember, UAE has now more than 200 schools and more than 100 universities. And it will continue to become a platform for educational institutes, more and more of educational institutes to crop up in UAE and invite students from different parts of the world.
I mean, you mentioned India, and there's a lot going on there. We had last year the demonetization, which shook up the economy. In general, there's a lot of changes going on in that country. But also, I noticed when I look at e-commerce in India, it's almost a race to the bottom, as the various big players operate there. But I talk to you about this because you sit in the middle of it all. And is it a case of no matter who wins, no matter how it shakes out, India is moving towards a more digitally linked up economy, and that can only be a good thing?
Absolutely, Mustafa. I mean, just imagine that if just 3 years back, there were almost 400 million people or 350 million people who were born in India but were not citizens of India. They had no identity. And today, they have been given an Aadhaar card, which basically means that now they are true citizens of India. They have an identity which allows them to now be part of the transaction flow inside the country in an organized manner. And this has been a very significant change that has happened in India. And you're now seeing that more and more such initiatives are being taken in different parts of the world. You're seeing many governments in Latin America doing this, and many governments in Asia now looking at very specific initiatives around this. So the important thing that we will see here is that there will be many firsts that will also happen. For example, it has been a very rare thing to see MasterCard, Visa, American Express coming together and facilitating a QR code method of payment in the country like India. So what you're also seeing is that the international players will have to look at becoming relevant from a local standpoint very quickly. Otherwise, you will have local infrastructure and local systems able to meet the requirements of a particular country. And the last thing there, Mustafa, is that if you really look at your statement of whether it's an overcrowded market in the payment segment, I believe that the journey of enabling digitization has just started. And payments is one key component which will run through any vertical, whether I'm collecting fees on behalf of a landlord, or if the tenant has to pay monthly fees? Or is it, look at diagnostic centers, look at hospitals? All of them will have to come to be part of this wave of digitization. And from this perspective, if you start naming the players in this industry, we can just count them in number of, in our hands. For example, in India, you don't have more than 9 or 10 true payment aggregators or online payment aggregators in such a large country like India. It's the same number you'll see that in UAE. So is that something that is there a room for others to come in and innovate? Absolutely. And what will happen is that each one will finally settle down in a particular space in which they have to kind of sharpen their offering to the market. But what you'll also see is that consumers for the next 5-10 years will be given the choice of payment methods. So whether it's debit cards or online banking or credit cards or wallets or prepaid cards. But after 5 or 10 years, what I expect is that the consumers will themselves then make a choice of the preferred payment method. But as of now, it's a time to give more choices to them and let them then choose which is the payment method that they prefer.
Sirish, I can hear your passion. You are a very passionate man when it comes to this industry and your company. And in May, Telr did a Series B investment round. You raised around $3 million US. And how much was that passion a factor behind drawing those investors in? Did they take your story on?
That's a good question. I think the investors. We have done 2 or 3 rounds of investments already, and one of the things that we continue to see is the support, not only of how this company has to grow, but this is smart money coming into Telr, which is primarily saying that yes, this is an industry and a sector in which you have to focus on infrastructure, build the foundation strongly, and then look at having this multi-country strategy, which allows you not only to connect the local buyers and local sellers, but also to help these sellers to reach out to the world. And I think we've had case studies to show to our existing and new investors time and time again that how small merchants have grown over a period of 3-4 years with us as we have grown with them, and how they have expanded from small start they made in UAE, for example, and now many of them are international merchants engaging in more than 7 to 10 countries and growing rapidly.
What was your valuation in that round? What's the company worth?
So we do keep that confidential, Mustafa, simply because I think the valuation is more in the eyes of the person who is actually making the investment. But I think to answer your question from a different perspective, for us it's not the valuation now that's very important for us. What is important for us is that when we require specific resources, whether it is support in terms of talent, whether it is support in terms of making the right strategic decisions of should we enter a new country or should we focus on a particular segment, I think this is where the investors play a significantly important role. For us, I think, and it becomes a very big distracting thing if we start looking at every step we make and what impact does it do on valuation. So I think if you and I talk in the next one year or 18 months, where what we are looking at is being a preferred financial partner for the SMEs in emerging markets. These emerging markets today do not have international players with international practices, and I think we want to fill that gap.
In 5 years, Sirish, I hope you're buying your old employers at PayPal. That's what I hope for Telr.
Thank you very much. It's a very encouraging comment, Mustafa.
And thanks for talking to me, and wish you best of luck, and hope to hear from you soon.
Sure. You take care, and let's stay connected.
I'm Mustafa Alrawi, and this is the Business Extra podcast. This week, we spoke to Sirish Kumar, CEO of Telr, about how e-commerce and the digital economy really has taken hold in 2017. I hope you've enjoyed it. Remember, for fuller coverage, you can also read, watch, and listen on the www.thenational.ae. Thank you all for listening. Subscribe to this and our other shows on iTunes. I'm Mustafa Alrawi. Join us again next week.